So like an amazing old, hopefully not haunted, radio in the background there. So you always have exceptional. Everybody has so much more interesting backgrounds than I do, which like you can't even see. Like I have like the books, which are kind of nice, but like literally I'm kind of shoved in a corner here.
Oh, no.
Like, you know, just like, so it's just the only place that I could get, which I'm kind of away from things and out of the way so my family can, you know, do other things while I'm doing my little internet thing.
My favorite thing is I'm too lazy to move my computer setup to like my other desk or to my bed when I'm teaching. And so like halfway into some of my classes, one of my students will be like, is that a bottle of Japanese whiskey on your background? And I'm like, yes, that is the Yamazaki 12. Let us get back to economic history. I do not want to get in trouble for this.
Well, I feel like I perpetually have some sort of like soft, like Vaseline on the camera kind of lighting, and I don't know. I need better equipment, I guess, but I don't know. Maybe it's atmosphere.
It's like this really nice kind of Instagram filter. It's very, you guys are classing things up again. Like I'm shoved in the corner. I'm all like washed out. It's terrible. So I mean, maybe that's fitting as I'm a senior male white scholar, right? Like it's just it's whiteness everywhere, right here. Yeah. Anyway, I think we should get going. So on that note, yes, welcome to Drinking with Historians with the old white man and the more interesting people of the show. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to just do a quick shout out to our lovely researcher, Rachel, who has again set up a really wonderful show for us and did all kind of background stuff. And I'll let her say hello, and then she will disappear and do all the work while we'll just drink and have fun. So.
Well, I mean, I'm going to drink too, so.
Okay.
Yay!
But thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Rachel.
All right, see you guys.
See ya.
All right. It is our great pleasure here to, hold on one second. Let me do what I'm doing here. There we go. All right. It is our great pleasure. Varsha and I are so excited to welcome Kathleen Belew here to Drinking with Historians. Kathleen, I'm sure you've seen her on CNN or MSNBC or things like that, or read her pieces in the New York Times. She teaches at the University of Chicago right now. Her book, Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement in Paramilitary America, has been prescient, just groundbreaking, really amazing and wonderful, and has deserved all the accolades it's gotten. So we're going to talk a lot more about that. But first, we have to get to the most important question, which is, Kathleen, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, I will tell you, I have here a LaCroix. You'll notice that it is an evening flavor that I have strong opinions about this. Early in the pandemic at my house, we decided there would be daytime and evening LaCroix. And I feel like this is passion fruit. It joins coconut and limoncello and key lime as the evening flavors.
Okay.
There are other daytime flavors, but the reason that it is the LaCroix tonight is because I am doing remedial dry January now, because I failed at dry January, so I have to finish February, but I'm almost there. And when I cross the finish line, maybe I'll come back and have a drink with you again.
That sounds like a promise. So, and it's not like, I mean, like, it's not like anything was going on in January for someone who studies the far right, you know. I
wish I could tell you that I failed dry January because of January 6th, but to be honest, I failed on the 3rd. So, I mean, I think it's I didn't make it very
yeah, I didn't even bother to try dry January. Not because like I need to have some bourbon every night, just because why put yourself through something that you don't need yet? I figure I can just I'll do dry January when I get a little bit older. I feel like I'm still technically in my 20s. So I am not doing dry January. I'm drinking Michter's bourbon tonight. It's one of my favorites because now that I know how to smell and taste a whiskey, you can smell the cinnamon, the vanilla, and the citrus in it. And I've like paid really close attention to it, and it's delicious. Matt, what are you drinking?
For when it's
I think I want to comment, like, still technically in your 20s, like you are in your 20s. So that's okay to say. The other thing too is, like, I mean, you owe it to your fans, like to our viewers, that you can't do dry January, right? I mean, like, what would Drinking with Historians be without Varsha and her whiskeys? So I'm just drinking some really simple Uncle Nearest Tennessee whiskey, the 1884. Since we were talking with Tracy Franklin last episode from the Nearest to Jack Foundation, I thought I would kick that off. It's also a full bottle, and like I had a day of kind of hellish meetings, so like we'll see what happens later in this episode. So I'm going to mostly listen to Kathleen and let her talk while I just drink. But I'm going to toss it over to Varsha for a sec so she can kind of kick us off, and I'm going to have a sip of my whiskey. So
Yeah, I think my first question is, how did you decide to study the white power movement? Like, why did you decide this is going to be your life work?
Sorry
Or one
about
of
the
your life
face.
works?
I was just Googling one of the questions, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So I wanted to do something on reconciliation in the United States. I was really drawn to this because so when I started back in 2005, it was really before we had very much of a national conversation about racial violence, racial inequality, and reconciliation in the way that we've seen in many other countries that have had similar social structures of white supremacy. So in contrast to something like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Project, or the many, many museum building projects in Germany, we just haven't had anything comparable. So this was before the National Museum for African American History. This was before the lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, which are the two biggest things that have happened in this landscape since then. And so I got into listening to the Greensboro, North Carolina Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was the first TRC process that was underway at that time. And what it was trying to do was look at this event in 1979 where a group of neo-Nazi and Klansmen had come together as what they called the United Racist Front. They opened fire on a leftist demonstration, and they killed 5 people, 4 white men and 1 Black woman. And they were acquitted on state and federal trials, and then mostly acquitted in a civil case. And as I was listening to, this was a TRC with no subpoena power, with no criminal, like it had no capacity to punish anybody. It had no state authority of any kind. It was just an NGO bootstrap kind of a thing. And people came to tell their story, including people from the perpetrators groups. And what they said over and over again was, we killed communists in Vietnam, so why wouldn't we kill communists in North Carolina? And I couldn't let go of that idea because it collapses so many different things, right? It mixes up wartime and peacetime. It mixes up battle and home. It mixes up different kinds of enemies all under this one big umbrella of communist. And so I went looking around and found that there's actually a huge paper archive left behind by this movement, ranging from their own stuff to FBI records to journalistic accounts. And that idea was just everywhere. This idea of the war has not stopped. So I got really interested in like what that narrative engine was doing for this movement. And then the surprise actually was, surprise, it's a social movement. And I was just completely astounded by how this was in every region of the country, how it was in every way but race, an incredibly diverse group of people, cutting across gender, class, age, sort of place in society, education level, etc. And I just really could not stop thinking about it. So that's where the book came from. Yeah. But I didn't set out to study these groups in the way that I guess I might have.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like in some ways, like a lot of the kind of greatest projects, or the projects that seem to go the furthest for individual historians, are ones you kind of stumble into. You go looking in an archive for something else, and you stumble upon something else, and you're just like, why is that happening? Like, I need to do it that way.
Yeah. I'm a real loose thread on the sweater kind of person. I'm like, I can't stop until I figure out what the thing is.
So in your book, you mentioned that a lot of the members of this paramilitary movement, this white power movement, are disenchanted from the Vietnam War, or they're Vietnam War vets. One of the questions I had is, does the current white power movement draw from a disenchantment of like the Gulf War or the Iraq War or the general war on terror?
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing because I think if we look at the whole lifespan of the Ku Klux Klan, we see that the best predictor for surges in activity, which we have a lot of data about, right? This has happened many times since 1866, the best correlating factor is not poverty or populism or immigration or massive civil rights gains. The best correlating factor is the aftermath of warfare. That's true of every surge in Klan activity in American history. So that made me wonder if that plus this thing about, bringing the war home made me wonder if this was going to be a movement of disaffected veterans. But the thing is that it turns out that this phenomenon is way bigger than that, because violence in the aftermath of warfare cuts across a whole bunch of categories of people. We see spikes in violence after war, but it's not just among men. It's not just among people of the right age to have served. It's not just among veterans. It's all of us. So I've come to think that there's one part of this that's about veterans having an outsized impact when they do join these groups, and that's here to be sure. But it's a small number of veterans as a whole. And I think it's also just that this movement is opportunistically using this window of opportunity to sort of it's sort of using this moment to radicalize people and recruit. So, along those lines, there are a lot of people in my book who I know did not serve in the Vietnam War, but say they did, right? So there are people who are performing that identity. And then there's a whole bunch of people who aren't claiming to have served, but are doing things like wearing camo fatigues, forming in paramilitary armies, training in camps, taking on the language. So it's also that the war is spreading beyond, not only beyond the war, but beyond veterans itself, right? Like there's this paramilitary aftermath effect that's also at play.
It seems like you see that a lot. I mean, like especially in contemporary images of kind of far right movements, right? The fetishization of the soldier aesthetic, right? So a lot of army surplus and stuff like that. I wanted, if I could, to ask a really quick follow-up though about guns specifically.
Sure.
We had a guest, Drew McKevitt, who's a professor at Louisiana Tech, who's writing a book on the history of guns. And like one of the things that he talked about was, which I just hadn't thought about, was in the aftermath of war is military surplus. Is that a lot more guns are kind of made available. And so how does that correlate kind of with what you're talking about as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So so the way I teach this to my students is actually, there's of course, the field defining Kathleen Belew book about women of the Klan. And she has a great pencil sketch in there of what a women's auxiliary Klan robe would have looked like in the 1920s, right? And if you look at it, it's very fashion forward, right? It's like slim cut. She's showing a respectable amount of ankle. It's like, it's not just a sheet. It's like, it's a statement.
And classy racism.
Classy Klan.
Yeah.
Classy Klan.
Quote unquote, just to be clear about if there's a translator. So part of the reason that they wear paramilitary gear in the 80s is for tactical readiness. And part of the reason is because it's cool in the 80s. Like everybody thinks camo is cool in the 80s. This is the moment of paintball and laser tag and Soldier of Fortune magazine. Like there's just a general cultural thing that they're also tapping into. And they're doing that because they're trying to figure out what kinds of cultural presentation will bring people into their groups, right? So just like today, when we think about what's up with the Hawaiian shirts or what's up with the polo shirts and khakis, or when we ask ourselves, why weren't they wearing their swastikas at the Capitol on January 6th? The answer is because these groups are opportunistically looking for ways to present a public facing image that is palatable to people and will work for recruitment.
Interesting. You mentioned Blee's book on women in the Klan, and you mentioned in your book, right, or in one of your chapters about gender and women and their participation in the White Power movement. What is the motivation for female participation in this movement? Is it similar to the Klan or is it different?
Yeah, so the Klan is inside of the movement that I'm talking about. The Klan is, so there's a through line there, but also there's kind of as many reasons for people to join these groups as there are people in these groups. And I think this is even more clear in the case of women, because in my archive, I have in some ways more of a ground game story about women than I do about men. So what we see are that there are people who are ideologically motivated from the beginning and find this movement and it's like they found their thing, right? And then there are people who kind of fall into it sideways through things like maybe their husband gets really in. There's one woman whose husband gets deeply involved, and she's got a 2-year-old. So what's she going to do? She has no job. She has a 2-year-old. She's got to relocate and be with him. And then she sort of gets drawn in because the movement provides childcare and homeschooling and all kinds of stuff. Like they'll pick you up from the airport, right? So there's a whole bunch of different ways in. For women, it's really interesting to think about from a historiographical perspective, how we have missed this story, because I think it's very similar to what happened with the New Right after World War II more broadly. In that sort of famous Alan Brinkley problem of conservatism kind of way, where he argued in the early 90s that historians sort of missed the New Right as it was coming up because we are oriented towards we tend to be leftist. We tend to be more oriented towards other kinds of political organizing, right? And similarly, I think, Michelle Nickerson makes this point really beautifully in Mothers of Conservatism, where she's talking about how we've often missed women's conservative political action because it doesn't match what we think of as women's activism in a feminist mode. So we missed a ton of the New Right because we weren't looking at women. We know from all the scholarship that women's grassroots organizing is where we get the New Right. And I think a similar thing is happening in the white power movement, where because people were taking women at their word, like these women will say, I'm not political, I'm not a leader, I'm not an activist, as they are driving getaway cars and publishing their own newspapers and running their own group, or even just as they are having their children, because in this movement, family and reproduction are highly politicized. So it's interesting to think about what our barometer is for reading the actions of people on the fringe, because we really did miss this story. And this is part of how we get to a understanding of the militia movement in the 90s as being totally disconnected from what was happening in the 80s.
Yeah. Is there a tension there? Like, that's really interesting about what you were saying about some of these subjects who are saying, like, what I do is not political, right? Yeah. When it clearly is political. And I wonder if, like, do you see that as a disconnect between kind of what historians tend to think of as kind of political action? Or is it part of, and maybe this is a leading question, and I apologize, is it also part of it that that we tend as historians to take our subjects at their word when they're and accept their framing instead of thinking about, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I've always argued for a pretty high degree of historical empathy for my actors compared to how they've been treated by a lot of people. But of course, I am skeptical of, sure, there's a lot of divides here between what they're saying and what they're doing. So I'm always sort of approaching with a grain of salt, I guess. But so here's an example. The woman who fell into the movement sideways because she needed childcare, right? So I'm going to finish her story via another story. So in the 80s, there was a terrorist bank robbing group called The Order, and their whole deal was stealing from people they thought were bad people. So banks, armored cars, dirty movie theaters, the Bon Marché department store in Seattle, etc. Fred Meyer, if you live in the Northwest, they liked to knock over Fred Meyer stores. So I'm
thumbs upping Fred Meyer, not knocking over Fred Meyer.
Not The Order.
I just want to be clear about that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, okay. Totally clear. So Fred Meyer is an excellent store. I think we can all agree. But so they took this money and distributed it to white power groups across the country. It was hugely important to the movement. They're part of how the movement got online, and we can talk about that later. But the leader, Robert Matthews, had this huge last stand with the federal government where he was killed and became a martyr for the movement. That story is usually told as if he's in a remote mountain cabin and he is surrounded by pursuing agents and he's holding them off with a machine gun. And then eventually they drop illumination flares and there's so much ammo in the cabin that the whole thing goes up in flames and he dies as a martyr, right? And the fight part is correct about that story. But the house is not a remote cabin. The house is a vacation house in Whidbey Island, Washington. And the house is not just with one person in it. The house is full of people right up until the feds get there. They are shredding files. There's women and kids. He's babysitting. They're helping him dye his hair so he can run away. They're cooking. Like they're just, they're doing social movement stuff. And that woman who fell into the movement sideways was in there at this time, right in this house before the feds closed in and before the fiery end of the siege. And during this time, Matthews wrote this document called the Order's Declaration of War, which remains like a foundational document for white power activists.
Mm-hmm.
And so in court later on, somebody asks this woman, hey, by the way, did you ever see this document? She's like, yeah. They're like, in what capacity? She goes, oh, I proofread it for them. So like, if you're a historian who studies women, I proofread it for them can mean a lot of things. I proofread it for them can mean I fixed the commas, but it can mean I put in another 3 paragraphs, or I changed the ending, or, you know, like it's a huge amount of editorial power that she wasn't claiming for herself. But like, at no point did she show up anywhere in the way that the movement was talking about this document, but she might have had an authorial hand. So it's really an interesting set of tensions around all of that.
Yeah. Oh my Lord. Sorry.
So before we go into Q&A, we have to address the elephant in the room / Capitol. So you mentioned the feds, you mentioned, you know, how government agencies attempted to, you know, had in your book, you talk about how federal agencies sort of attempted to keep track of these of the white power movement, but they sort of failed in certain aspects. What were your feelings on January 6th about, you know, the role the federal government and federal agencies like the FBI and other agencies should have had? And do you think the hearings that we've had recently, or the commission that they're trying to have, is going to change anything? Like, what do you think they should focus on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that we can think about white power really as a transcalar problem, right? It doesn't exist just at the level of surveillance resources, or at the level of legislation, or at the level of policing, or how journalists talk about it, or public understanding. It's across all those things. So we need solutions that are going to go across all those different registers, which means that any one of these things coming online is not going to be enough to deal with it. So the good news, I think, is that a lot more people are focused on this right now as a problem than at any point in the story that I tell in Bring the War Home. I take hope in that. The DHS and FBI have now oriented a tremendous amount of resources to this. The DHS has, you know, sort of declared that white supremacist extremism is the largest domestic terror threat to the homeland. That comes with, you know, resources and manpower and all kinds of other things. And that happened under the Trump administration. So now that we also have buy-in at the executive level, I think that there is an opportunity here to get some stuff done. And I think that after January 6th, there's also more momentum, not only in surveillance communities, but, well, first of all, publicly on the ground. I think people are concerned about this in many circles. And also, I think that there's a conversation in the military finally about figuring out how to do better monitoring and de-radicalization of the problem in the ranks, which would be huge as well. So I am cautiously optimistic, but obviously also very worried about mass casualty attacks in the near future.
Yeah. One of the things that's kind of come up, and I have one other question after this, but as a follow-up, is that one of the things that I've seen a number of historians of the 19th century who have published public pieces and advocated, for example, in response to the actions on January 6th, kind of rethinking kind of the Klan acts, right, of the 1870s and 80s and things like that. Like is that a model? Like, so, and this kind of gets at one of the questions that our viewers had, is like, so if wars cause an increase in this type of activities, like what kind of brings them in? And you kind of answered that with your response about kind of a transcalar approach, but like, is legislation, is policing going to be the main focus, or is it going to be something else?
Yeah, so what brings them in is a great way to think about it, because I think that what we've seen is not any kind of actually dealing with this, but more just writing out the cycle, right? So I think that we've gotten lucky a couple of times, not even lucky, that's a terrible way to describe that, but but if you think about, like, for instance, the end of the Klan in the 1920s, which is the biggest one and the most public facing one, wasn't because of successful prosecution, it's because there was a leadership crisis that happened because of the brutal rape and murder of a white woman that discredited the organization so much that it really had like a membership crisis, and imploded. But like, it's not because anybody put pressure on it, it's because there was an internal issue. And it's interesting to me that we're still using the Klan Act as like the main legislative instrument here, because I mean, we're talking about something that was put in place in 1877, and it has things like it makes it a crime to go in a mask upon the public highway, right? Like to go in disguise upon the public highway, to conspire to, I forget what the language is, but it makes it a conspiracy instead of an individual crime to do some of the Klan kinds of violence that were happening. And even then, I mean, I would argue that the Klan Act was somewhat effective, but I'm not fully convinced. I think I saw Karen Cox going by on this call, so maybe she can come and tell us, but I'm not fully convinced that the first Klan really dissolved because of the Klan Act so much as the culture changed in the post-Reconstruction moment, and lynching became a commonplace open activity, and you don't really need to be in a mask anymore. I'm not sure that for me that's a fully settled question about the efficacy of the Klan Act in really doing that. So all of this to me, and sort of like the cyclical nature of the problem, really points to the need for that thing that started me on this project, which is a real truth and reconciliation process, or a real public history reckoning about the place of racial violence in our past, which people can't agree on, as we see in things like the, whichever commission that just was, 1776 commission, I guess.
1776, yeah.
Yeah. We can't agree on the basic facts about what has happened. And I think that has real life consequences, not to be super history nerdy about it.
No, I think that absolutely makes sense. I mean, I think that's something that we certainly talked about on here. And I mean, like I co-published with a colleague a piece in the Daily Beast about this, is about the need for, I mean, history isn't a neutral actor, right? Like it doesn't do things on its own. Is like you need to talk about things in order for the events and activities to come to light, right? And then you can talk about like, well, what do we do with those? So I think a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, I mean, that seems absolutely necessary if we're going to actually kind of uncover what's actually happened over the last several years. So
yeah, and I think it's part of the effort there would be about, you know, they're story making projects. It's about figuring out what are the narratives that are and are not, you know, factual and ethical to tell about our past. And it doesn't mean, you know, I think the pushback often comes from the place of thinking that makes us a bad country or something, but historians just don't tend to see it this way. I think generally, it's just a matter of here is the thing that happened and where do we go from here. I think reasonable people can agree on telling a real story about who we are and where we come from.
Yeah. So I want to, before we're almost to audience Q&A, and we have a bushel of amazing questions that I want to get to. But before we do that, I want to ask, going back to something we talked about earlier, was about the aesthetics of the white power movement, especially in the 80s and the 90s, and about pop culture, right? Yeah. Like movies like Rambo and things like that. Like what role did pop culture play in this?
Huge. Yeah. So one of the places you can see this is in Soldier of Fortune magazine, which I was lucky in my dissertating. The Yale Library has the full run of Soldier of Fortune. I'm not sure who collected that, but props to you, Yale Library. It is, I was back leafing through it again recently, and like, as you leaf through it, you're like, oh yeah, there it is. Like, it's just, and it's just incredible to watch, because on the one, like, so Soldier of Fortune, for people who have not encountered it before, is a paramilitary magazine from the 80s, some of which is actual violence, like people going to Nicaragua and Zimbabwe as mercenary soldiers to try to kill communists. And some
they're writing about this in this magazine.
Sorry? Oh yeah.
And
yeah,
wow,
they carry advertisements about like how to join the Rhodesian military and how to kill communists, and they talk about communists as bagging a deer, like killing communists as bagging a deer. So some of the white power movement guys become mercenaries kind of instead of joining the Klan. And that funnels through Soldier of Fortune, right? But then some of Soldier of Fortune is just cultural. It's just armchair warrior stuff. And occasionally, if you're really into it, maybe you go to a gun sight ranch training course or go to a convention. And the interesting thing is, like, I think that the boundary between those things is super porous, because that the group we were talking about before the order, they got their camo fatigues that they wore in an actual paramilitary camp where they learned how to attack infrastructure and assassinate people and do those armed robberies. They got those uniforms from a Soldier of Fortune convention. So I think it's difficult to draw a bright line between what's harmless cultural fun and what's actually enabling violence.
Mm.
I feel that way about the entire Nerf gun toy aisle at Target too. I mean, like there's paramilitary overflow all over the place in our country. And like if you go look at the Nerf guns, which of course are for children, you can get like tactical readiness vests, Nerf darts and stuff. It's very serious. Like it's
yeah.
Yeah. So moving on to audience questions. So we talked a little bit about January 6th, but one thing I was really interested in when I was reading your book and doing the reading that I've done on the extreme right in the US, recently so in the last decade or so, Ian asked this question. We've seen this like huge rise of white nationalist extremism and libertarian extremism at the same time, right? So alongside people like Trump and, Proud Boys and Richard Spencer, you've also seen the rise of libertarian amazing figures like Paul Ryan and Neil Gorsuch and all these people. Is that a coincidence, or in your research, do you see a connection between right-wing racist movements and white power movements and the right-wing libertarian movement?
So I think I would go back to the argument that Lisa McGurr makes about this in Suburban Warriors, where she sort of establishes that there's really the key alliance that allows the new right to sort of gain the momentum that it does is that it brings together evangelicals, social conservatives, and libertarians. Those three groups, this is a very contingent moment. It didn't have to go that way. Like they have a lot of fights. Those three groups have a lot of disagreements, and the tensions between those three viewpoints, I think, are still very much at play in our politics. But all three of those positions are mobilized to some extent by the white power movement for their own sort of opportunistic purposes, right? So evangelical churches are growing enormously and also becoming much more political during the 80s and the 90s. And white power activists recruit from there. And some even are in evangelical churches and in white power churches at the same time. So like one of my central actors describes himself as a identity Baptist. So white power church and a Baptist. Like he thinks he can practice both and that it's not in conflict. Many of them have libertarian positions. I think libertarian and survivalism are very comfortable with each other. And then of course, social conservatism is really important to the white power movement. They just frame it differently. So the list of issues like opposing immigration, opposing abortion, opposing interracial marriage, opposing LGBTQ rights, opposing feminism, they oppose all that stuff, as do social conservatives, but they say they're opposing it because they want to avoid lowering the white birth rate. So it's the same set of issues, it's just mobilized in a different and kind of more extreme way.
So I have a question that's not sort of a quick follow-up. So I look at a lot of things from like a foreign policy standpoint. And so recently I've been like looking at this historical committee called the America First Committee and their obsession with not entering World War II. Yeah. And after Trump, got elected, I've been thinking a lot about how, a lot of foreign policy experts, regardless of like where they stood politically, they were like freaking out about America's place in the world. So my question is, how did the white power movement, how does the white power movement reconcile their obsession with, whiteness being the most important thing, as well as their interest in not having, America's place being number one, right? Because if America does not continue to contribute to the UN, if it doesn't continue to, have its position in NATO, how does it continue to stay the quote unquote number one country in the world?
So one important thing to remember here is that the nation in white nationalism after 1983 is not the United States. The nation in white nationalism is the Aryan nation. They're interested in a transnational white polity of Aryan people. And many of them are directly interested in the overthrow of the US government by violence. Others want a white ethno-state. They talk about different kind of homeland projects, and they even identify this through things like they have a legal foundation called the Cause Foundation that stands for CAUSE, Canada, Australia, United States, South Africa, Europe as like the salvageable countries, thinking that if they can hold those countries and populate them with white people, they can then launch campaigns to take over the world. They are profoundly transnational. They send their stuff out everywhere. Aryan Nations mails materials everywhere. World Church of the Creator and Wotan's Vote both have like hundreds of chapters in other countries. And we see today that this circulation is all over the place because, if you look at the manifestos from like the Norway shooting, the Christchurch shooting, El Paso, Charleston, Pittsburgh, what am I missing? There's a bunch. They all share the same ideology. So one of the important things to know about that is that this points us to the importance of the Turner Diaries, which is a book that's held very deeply by this movement. If you are listening right now and you're curious about this, please don't buy a new copy of this book, which will funnel money back to these groups sometimes still. I generally am a big fan of copyright, but this is available to you for free as a pirated PDF all over the internet. And I think that's an ethical action. So show me where
support white supremacists.
So anyway,
Yeah.
I say go anyway, but it's also, so as you will see if you read this book, it is not important to the movement because it is a good novel. It is a very bad book, but it's important because it fulfills this very important, it answers a mystery, or I guess it answers a conundrum for the movement, which is how could a fringe movement hope to overthrow the most militarized superstate in world history, right? It says it's like a gnat trying to assassinate an elephant. It's a big problem. So what the Turner Diaries does is lay out a game plan, a set of strategies about how they could do this in the guise of a sort of like, it's written in the style of like an 80s apocalypse novel, going up to the successful establishment of a white world. So they lay this out through asymmetrical warfare and sabotage, including mass casualty attacks. And then they take an air base in Southern California, which has a nuclear weapon, which lets them stave off a US counterattack. Then they have like an incremental campaign moving east where they try to like undermine the government and take it over. And then eventually they provoke a nuclear war between the US, Russia, and Israel. And then in the aftermath of nuclear war, they're able to seize power. After which they nuke the Pentagon, and then they assassinate all race traitors by hanging. And then they nuke all people of color who've been exiled to the South in concentration camps. And then they unleash biological and chemical weapons on Asia and Africa in order to realize an all-white world.
Wow.
Now, so that is
deeply flawed and deeply incorrect. Because if you nuked just people of color, you're increasing radiation across the world. You can't do that. Oh,
I mean, that's only one problem with this book. So I mean, there are many problems here. There are many situations in this book. There's a whole gender reading of the book that we don't have time for probably. So this is of course not the belief. It's not the literal belief of everybody in this movement that they're trying to realize the Turner Diaries, right? This is the most extreme distillation of what they think, right? But this is the cultural lodestar. This is the manual of operations. This is the thing that shapes the Oklahoma City bombing. It shapes a ton of other violent action. It shapes group structure. And we know that because we see things like, so the order that we've been talking about kept a stack of 15 copies in the bunkhouse. 15, not one, a stack, right? They handed them out free at rallies. Timothy McVeigh sold it on the gun show circuit. Like, this book is really important to them. So we can look there to see how they sort of articulate the imagined future possibilities of what they're thinking about.
That kind of brings us to another question that the audience had. I mean, you talked about kind of the sameness, and you're absolutely right. I mean, even as somebody who's just a kind of a casual observer of these things, like who's seen, mostly because I've seen the medievalism that's inherent in these manifestos, right? And it's so the same. And so the question was talking about kind of like, how do these groups communicate? Like, so how is it simply kind of a cultural connection, or is it an active affiliation like between US and Europe, or something like that, or is it something else?
No, I think that they see it as part of a movement. So there's a Swedish sociologist who studied it that called it a smorgasbord, which I think is apt, but kind of maybe too light. I think that, it's very common for people to move between these groups, to have overlapping ideologies, to switch from, so like if you were today, it would surprise me not at all to hear about somebody like moving from Proud Boys to Oath Keepers to the base, for instance, or moving between these different groups. And people have spent a tremendous amount of energy on things like, okay, exactly how many of them are Klansmen, how many are Nazis, how many are skinheads, which slogan goes to which group, which uniform goes to which group, like which guy belongs to which thing. And they don't treat it like that on the ground at all. And this is even more true in the present moment, I think, because of, the ubiquity of social media activism. And while we're on that subject, it's worth noting that this movement has been using social network activism online since the early 1980s, like 1983, 84. Yeah.
They have real good practice with this.
Proto internet encrypted message boards called LibertyNet. LibertyNet had stuff you would expect, like assassination lists, ideology, stuff like that. It also had personal ads and recipe exchanges and other kinds of cultural content. So it's really important to know that we are not new to a moment of social movement, online activism being like a new strategy. We are generations into that for these groups. So the fact that it is bigger and louder in our lives because of the pandemic is a factor. And I think it's exponentially faster and stronger than it was, but it's not new.
Yeah.
So wait,
can I ask a follow-up real quick?
Yeah.
Sorry. This brings up to another question is about kind of the laundering of these ideas, and maybe that's not the right word, right? Or the mainstreaming is that. So one of the questions, this isn't specifically the question, but thinking about places like PragerU or other places in which like this very clearly kind of hate-filled content is kind of packaged very neatly and suggested to be just like kind of common sense and educational. Like is that old, or is that something that's new that's been happening as well?
I think it is newly operationalized. And I think it's a lot more efficient than it was, partly because people are just getting really good at, short video instructionals, right? I mean, it's something we're all pretty comfortable with now. And I think part of it's that, but we see things like that earlier. So for instance, David Duke, who was at the time was the head of the National Association for the Advancement of White People, in his presidential bid in 1992, we know because he said so that Pat Buchanan took some of the planks from the Duke platform, right, in his primary challenge to George H.W. Bush. And we know that Bush took some of his planks from the Buchanan platform, and then they are ensconced in law, right? So there's a way that even at the outside of the political process, people can, mainstream these ideas. Mm-hmm. The other thing to think about is like, this is a movement that has always worked with sort of different levels of intensity. So if you think about so I'll just bracket what I'm about to say by saying numbers are a very bad way to understand this for a lot of reasons. And I am not confident in the numbers I'm about to tell you, but the best guess that we have is that we could think about a series of concentric circles for how big this is in the 80s. And in the middle, you might find like 10 to 25,000 people. It's not very many people, but they live and breathe in the movement. They go to church in the movement. They get their marital counseling in the movement. They pick each other up from the airport. They share childcare. They, homeschool their kids with movement curricula. And then outside of that, there are people who are less involved. Now we're talking about 100,000 people or so. And those people do things like donate money, regularly read or subscribe to newspapers, and go to marches, public facing action. Then outside of that, we have like another 175,000 people. No, sorry. That middle ring is 100 to 175,000 people. And then outside is 450,000 people big. And those people don't donate money, and they don't regularly subscribe to a newspaper, but they read the newspaper, right? So now we're talking about informal circulation. Somebody passes it to you and read it, but they're regularly ingesting ideas. And so what we're concerned with that we really don't know very much about is the circle of people around that, right? Which is bigger than 450, and more porous. And out here are people who would never read a newspaper that says like official newspaper of the Knights of the KKK, but would agree with one or more ideas that are presented in it, especially if they come to you through a social contact, right? Like through a friend over a dinner table, through a romantic
Facebook
relationship.
Post. Mm-hmm. A Facebook post.
Yeah. Facebook post from a friend. So that mode of organizing does two different things. It pushes ideas from that radical center out to the mainstream, and it pulls in people who can be radicalized.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, it's something that I think medievalists have talked about too, is that the way that the Middle Ages has been radicalized is that oftentimes, like, you'll see, this has happened to me, right? Like I'll be teaching something on the Crusades, for example, and there's a kid who has a laptop open and there's a 3%er sticker, right? Or an Oath Keeper sticker, like on their laptop. Like I know I know why that person's in my class. And
Wow.
when they're challenging me, it's not necessarily like, I don't know that I'm going to talk that person out of, being a member of the Oath Keepers or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's the kids around them, who are ingesting that kind of material and thinking about that, the scourge of Islam or something like that, right? That are really problematic. I think that concentric circle thing is a really interesting way to think about it. So
yeah, well, and the other thing that comes out to me in that example is, first of all, that we really don't have a good response for meeting radicalized students on college campuses or on high school campuses anywhere. We don't really have an infrastructure for that. And that's another thing that I think we need to think about. Like the first call when people are dealing with this is often to like a disciplinary body or to the police. And of course, parents and often teachers and mentors are really reluctant to make that call for a lot of good reasons.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that strikes me about that answer is that we're just living in a time when I think most of us have encountered this content online somewhere, right? Like this is ubiquitous.
Sure.
We're now all swimming in this ocean together. This is not, in some dark corner of the internet. This is all over the place. So it makes it to me a very urgent project to think about how we encounter it and what we should do next.
So one of the questions that I had that's sort of a follow-up to this, that's a two-parter, is anytime, somebody on Twitter tweets about how, in Germany or in European countries, Twitter bans all the neo-Nazis and all this kind of stuff. And Nazis are banned from a lot of social media based on European laws. So a person who's viewing Jonathan asked, what are the key differences between white supremacists in the United States versus Europe? Is there, a difference between how much they're allowed to do in the US versus Europe? Or are there other differences?
So I think there are differences everywhere. And I should be clear that historians usually think about white supremacy as a broad umbrella category that includes both individual belief systems, including but not limited to, people who would say, yes, I am racist, but also all the systemic kinds of racism that are baked into our, histories, legal system, incarceration system, medical system, et cetera, that results in racial inequality. So, but white power activists in both places, I think, a lot of it varies by law from country to country. And of course, there are cultural differences, right? So like in the period that I look at, there's a stronger sense of identification with the Confederacy in the South than in the Northwest, because people have that history and feel that as a deep part of their identity. But that's not to say that it's absent in the Northwest. So I think it sort of varies. And I think like my guess, although I have not studied this, my guess is that those distinctions are less important in the age of connectivity that we now live in.
Yeah. Can I ask a short follow-up on that? Is that's something that seems to be kind of bubbling up, and I think it's something that historians maybe take for granted, but I mean, maybe we need to expand upon this more, is the role of history in justifying these positions, right? The way that it creates legitimacy for these far-right movements. Like, is that something that you've seen kind of consistently in?
Absolutely. I was thinking about, why was I thinking about this? I was just thinking about this because I was listening to something that was outside my area, and now I've immediately forgotten what it was. It might come back to me, it might not, but it struck me, whatever I was listening to, about how often denialism. Oh, it was about this new dust up about there was a piece in the New Yorker about Japan and
comfort women.
Yeah, the comfort women.
Yeah.
You guys should talk to Amy Stanley, by the way, who was involved in that.
I love her.
Excellent guest. She's amazing. But so, like what struck me about that is how often historical denial is at the center of like a nationalist politics, even when the rest of the context is not necessarily related, right? So it came up in that piece that nationalists in Japan are interested in kind of papering over the reality of sex slavery during World War II for comfort women by calling them prostitutes and saying that they willingly engaged in contracts, which turns out to be just like not grounded in historical factual evidence at all. Is that, sorry, spoiler alert for the New Yorker. It's a really good piece, you should read it anyway, but that's what happened. So, and it just struck me that, like, so Holocaust denial is at the center of this, but so are things like denial of, the brutality of slavery, like the idea that we can't call slavery a system of injustice, or that we should say the triangle's trade instead of slavery, or like these little changes to the way we think about our history have huge implications for our politics. And I think, Elizabeth McRae's book, I think, is another foundational text for me in thinking about this, Mothers of Massive Resistance, which looks at the way that women in the South and elsewhere really staged, small battles over classroom content to retell the story of Reconstruction to prop up Jim Crow, and then to retell the story of Jim Crow to prop up the anti-civil rights movement stuff, all the way up through busing, and in ways that really extend beyond the South. I found that really interesting to think about.
Yeah, so the use of history is weaponized in multiple across multiple fronts, right? Like it's yeah.
But also that there's this kind of ultra nationalism that requires absence of history, like that requires us to not engage with the thing that actually happened, which I find, like patriotism is such a loaded word, and I don't want to sort of bring my own politics into this, but I find it a deeply unpatriotic action to sort of not want to engage with the historical record of what happened. I don't think it makes, I don't know. I don't think it makes us bad citizens or a bad country, capital B, bad country or something to do that work. And I think, I just think, I don't know, it's really interesting to me.
Yeah. So one of the questions based on this history question, right, is like recently there's been this huge debate since Trump left office or since he lost. There's just been huge debate on Twitter as well as in a bunch of magazines about whether or not he is a fascist, whether or not, there are fascists in the Republican Party, and people are just obsessed with, on all sides of the spectrum, people are either obsessed with making this seem exactly like 1930s Germany, or they're obsessed with making it, no, this is nothing like 1930s Germany. And no one is really interested in like the in-between, which is like, what is American fascism real? Does it exist outside of European fascism? So when you were writing your books, did you come across the term fascism, or did you decide that that wasn't like an important category?
So my book was in copy edits when Charlottesville happened in 2017. And the big fascism conversations really came out after that. And I think, so many people are specialists on Germany. I wouldn't want to speak out of turn. And I follow Timothy Snyder about his sort of set of opinions about all of this. But I think the long and short of it is a kind of a weenie historian answer of me, but like, I think parts of it are similar and parts of it are not similar, right? We are totally off the map in terms of living through coronavirus, and all of the ways that has radically changed our life, and we are totally off the map with the Trump moment, I think, in terms of what it means for American politics. It's something that would not have been possible at an earlier time period, I think, I would argue, because of technology. I'm always scared to say that to medievalists, because I know that like all the technological breakthroughs are relative, but I know, but like, I think bits of it are very similar. And I think like what we know, I'm also not a person who like, I would not claim to be a Trump expert. I study the white power movement rather than him. I mean, like what we know for sure is that people in the Trump administration have indeed used and deployed white power materials for their own purposes. So like we know Stephen Miller from his emails read and distributed Camp of the Saints, which is a novel very similar to the Turner Diaries. We know that. What we don't know is, did he do that because he believes in what's in that book? Is he subscribing to that ideology? Is he interested in nativism and sees these people as fellow travelers in some way? Is he interested in using them to win an election? I don't know. I have no way of knowing why, right? So to me, the opportunistic sort of like political part of the Trump administration is really a cloud between the things that they're doing and how much meaning I can really place on them in terms of white power rhetoric. You know what I mean? Like I don't have the kind of archive that would show me what happens next with all these people, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah, that always seems, I mean, like it's always so frustrating when you encounter people who talk about history as saying it's something simple, because I think historians at their best are killjoys and they say, no, it's more complicated. Whatever you think,
It's
it's
like,
more
how'd you get that
complicated than that.
tattooed on my chest?
Right? Yeah,
5
exactly.
feet of
Like, I'm like,
historical
okay.
thinking, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, a couple of people sort of asked whether or not, white power movement sort of falls into a definition of fascism or neo-fascism. And I think you're exactly right. Some of it's fascism, some of it's not. I think what it points to is that American fascism, if we can use that term, is different than the historical definitions of fascism that we've seen.
Yeah, and I can tell you for sure it's anti-democratic, it's terroristic, it's revolutionary. And to me, those words were more important than kind of getting into the debate about fascism. The other thing is, like, at the time when my book came out, fascism was thought of as sort of a specialist topic.
Now everyone is an expert.
Yeah, so we've really had a bit of a change since then.
So we are, unfortunately, I mean, we have so many questions, but we are unfortunately almost out of time. I wanted to ask you about the apocalypse. So your next book, Home at the End of the World, which is coming out sometime in the future with Random House. Everybody should pre-order it as soon as it becomes available. But so
that's going to be in a while, just to manage
yeah,
expectations.
Yeah. So, but I mean, I think that's been a really fascinating thing. Like, as a scholar of medieval apocalypticism, is seeing the way that these themes kind of recur. And it's obviously not a one-to-one thing or anything like that. But could you talk a little bit about kind of what role does this kind of oncoming end, this idea of apocalypse, play in the people that you're interested in?
Oh, you bet. Yeah. So one of the really interesting things about Christian identity, which is the main sort of, there's two religious schools in the white power movement in the period that I look at. One is Odinism, which is all about like Norse paganism. And then there's Christian identity, which I think is more important in terms of how it weaponizes people. And Christian identity, like evangelicals in the same time period, is very interested in the end of the world. They're very into the Book of Revelations. They're very into end times prophecy. They're very into things like late great planet Earth and prognostications about how much time there is left and all of this kind of stuff, who the Antichrist is. But unlike evangelical congregations, Christian identity does not have a rapture. So this is important. Evangelicals believe that the end times are coming, but that the good and faithful will be peacefully transported out of the world and into heaven before the bad stuff, before the tribulations.
Tim LaHaye stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. No such luck for Christian identity people. They believe that they have to either survive the tribulations or they have to become soldiers for God and clear the world of enemies before Christ can return. And enemies for Christian identity is all people of color, all Jewish people, dead before Christ can return. So what that really does is transfigure race war into holy war. So the second book is only a little bit looking at them. I'm also interested in kind of the broader landscape of apocalyptic imaginaries in the 90s and what it tells us about, a lot of things: environmental contamination, school shootings, and religious rifts. And it's set, the book is about Colorado in the 90s, which is also where I grew up, and ends sort of, well, it's going to have a section on Columbine and the shooting there, and sort of the way that that's become the marker of this age of catastrophic violence that we're living through today. And the thing that I really like about apocalypse stories is that at the end of the day, and hear me out, I know I always write about dark stuff, I think they are very hopeful, because I think we're actually we're not interested in stories about an asteroid hits the world and we're all dead. That's not the movie, right? I mean, I guess One Time with Bruce Willis, that was the movie. But the movie is usually about adaptation and survival. It's about how are people going to regroup in the face of catastrophe and form new communities and figure out a way to get through it, right? There's a real thing there that I think is hopeful and interesting. And that's where I really would like to spend some time for my second book.
That's fair.
We need another hour to talk about this because I'm so excited, because I think you're absolutely right. Like, there's something about apocalypse stories, and I think I've told this story before. Like, I've taught, I teach a course on apocalypse, and I've taught it twice. One was when immediately before Donald Trump was elected, and one was immediately before the coronavirus hit. So I'm never going to teach this course ever again because I
I'm
feel like I'm
supposed to
somehow
teach one
responsible.
next quarter, and I'm like, oh no.
Yeah.
Oh.
But I think there's a thread of within even kind of apocalypse as catastrophe, that original idea of it is revelation, is that is a transformation. There's something hopeful, that there's something on the other side. You have to go through, but it is ultimately hopeful. And that's so interesting that you're framing your book that way. Because
well, I have to. I'll write to you about swapping syllabus materials.
Please,
I would love to see what you do. Yeah. It's super fun. I wish we had time for all the questions, but this was a really nice time.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Thank you again so much. So please, we'll get this up on YouTube as soon as we can. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for joining us. It's been a delightful hour. I mean, the crappy meetings I had are just a memory nowadays, and it has nothing to do with the drinking. It has everything to do with the lovely conversation. So thank you everybody for joining us. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Please check the website for more information on our next episode. On behalf of Varsha and Kathleen and Rachel behind the scenes, thank you, Rachel, for managing things on us. Let me close by simply saying cheers.
Cheers. Thank you so much, Kathleen.